Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology. And once you're on there, you can pick up revision guides, flashcards for revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so onto this episode, and I'm delighted to welcome my guest, Dr Gemma Ahearne. Gemma, thank you very much for joining me.
Hi Matthew, thank you very much for having me on.
Thanks, Gemma. Whereabouts you coming in from? Liverpool area, is that right?
Yeah, I'm based in the School of Law and Social Justice at the University of Liverpool, and I teach in Criminology and Sociology.
Fantastic. Tell us a little bit more about yourself as well then, Gemma. Tell us a little bit more about what you do.
Okay, so for the last almost 20 years, I've been involved in and around the sex industry. And for the last almost 9 years, I've been lecturing in higher education. My PhD, which I did at Leeds Beckett University, which I got a scholarship there for, was based off the back of the Corston report. And it was looking at the experiences of women in prison who self-identify as sex workers, and looking at the various barriers that they have to overcome.
Thank you, Gemma. For clarification, I always say this to students about operationalising a term. What constitutes or counts as sex work?
So sex work is quite an umbrella term, and on my specialist module, Crime, Justice and the Sex Industry, we start in the first week by interrogating what we mean by the term, because it changes every year. When I started teaching 8.5 years ago, what we meant then by sex work has definitely changed now, because there's so many different, digital economies of sex work now, for instance. So I would explain sex work as being about the transaction of a sexual service, whether that is full contact sex work, i.e. prostitution, whether that's escorting, stripping, pornography, online sex work, BDSM, commercial services, and so on. That kind of umbrella term.
And does your research, do you look just at women in the sex work industry, or do you also look at men? How do you focus your sample?
So my research does focus on women, but some of the research that I've been involved with, so for example, last summer, I was commissioned to do a needs assessment for a Scottish sex work charity, Umbrella Lane. In that sample, we also covered non-binary peoples and some male sex workers, but my research focuses on women, yeah.
Thanks, Gemma. And I'm always interested how people arrived in the field that they did. What sort of got you interested in looking at that particular area? Was there a significant event or moment that caused your interest?
So definitely most if not all of the things I research and teach, I've got lived experience of, and I really value that lived knowledge, and that in a journal article that I had out just 2 weeks ago, I talk about the value of lived experience and the value of feminist standpoint theory. So, and the messiness of research and those epistemology. So for me, I started as a lap dancer in the sex industry when I was 18, and I went to university at 18 and I dropped out for a number of reasons, and I was in the industry for 5 years. So for me, that was the starting point for my interest. And for me, that is very much where my teaching and where my research is anchored. And yeah, that's what's given me such an interest in the field.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that as well, Gemma. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you actually do your research? What kind of methods and so on before we start to look at your findings?
Yeah, so for my PhD, I used reading aloud and creative writing, because I don't like to assume, like I'm dyslexic and I only got diagnosed in October. I never like to assume that people can read or write or are confident with reading and writing, because my own dad couldn't read or write very well at all. So I like to use creative methods, and that was before I knew I was dyslexic. Now that makes sense to me. Now I've got that diagnosis that I am a creative and visual thinker. So for my PhD findings or for my methodology, I used focus groups. We used 3 very broad research questions, because I had to have some questions to get through the Ministry of Justice Ethics Board and University Ethics Board. I couldn't just go in with no questions. And I used, focus groups that we used poetry out loud, and we used that to explore people's own identities and life histories and get them to explain their own experiences, their own feelings through the use of poetry and prose. And some of the participants actually wrote their own poetry as well.
How do you go about approaching people, Gemma? Because obviously it's a sensitive topic. It's perhaps a topic that's a little bit taboo, or being British, we could be quite prudish about it. So how do you actually get in touch with your sample? Do you kind of use volunteer or snowball samples?
So normally for my research, I use snowball sampling, in terms of my PhD, with it being that I did the research, it was a little bit different, because obviously the gatekeeping access issues are a lot stricter. They're a lot more stringent, understandably. So for that, I actually met a gatekeeper. On my first day of my PhD, I attended a conference, because I'm always sort of ahead of myself. So I attended a conference at HMP Aston Grange, which is an open women's prison, and it was on supporting sex workers in custody and post-release. I met some people there, and I met a key person who acted as my gatekeeper, who was a custodial manager in the prison that I did my research in, which I'm allowed to say, which is HMP Newhall. And he put the word out for me. He put the word out with women who might want to be involved. He also put the word out for me with the Pathway 9 lead. So in the Corsten report 2007, where Baroness Corsten undertook a systematic review of the female prison estate, she recommended these 2 new pathways, and Pathway 8 was for women who've been the victim of domestic violence, and Pathway 9 was for women involved in sex work. So there is a Pathway 9 lead in each prison. So he gave my details, he gave, my participant information sheet and so on, my consent forms, to the Pathway 9 lead, who again was more into, because it is a very hidden demographic in prison. It's really hidden. Often people don't want to disclose they're involved in the sex industry because they fear further criminalisation, or they fear being judged. They just fear recriminalising themselves, essentially. So that's how it happened. And after I got my first focus group that ran weekly for 10 weeks, 2 hours a week, those women had told their friends about me and said, go and Gemma's doing this research and we've enjoyed it. And so then I had another group, and that was a pure snowball sample that came from that first group of participants that I then did the same with, 2-hour focus group once a week for 10 weeks, which is a good way of doing it, because you have to build up trust. And you have to build up a rapport. You can't just walk in and do an interview on such sensitive, potentially traumatizing topics and walk away with rich data. And I also think for anyone who's thinking of entering this field, they have really got to think about the ethics of it. Just because you get through your university ethics committee or anything else, Ministry of Justice, you've really got to think about the potential impact on your participants. So for me, that is about building up a relationship, building up trust, building up a rapport. And I just think that makes it better for the participants.
Absolutely. But and was there any sort of reluctance to start with? Did it take a while before people opened up and shared their experiences?
I had anticipated that there would be, but there wasn't at all. People just wanted to talk. I guess because in the prison is such a microcosm, it's such an intense, strange environment. And when you've got a researcher who wants to speak to people, who wants to know what they think, people want to talk, and they want to have someone to take on board their experiences.
Let's get into the findings then. Gemma. So do you want to tell us kind of some of your overarching findings from just from your kind of focus groups with the women?
Definitely. So my PhD broke down the findings into 4 chapters. And the first findings chapter was sex work as a risky business. That it's a very, unique form of labour. It comes with heightened risks. They can be more broadly felt in society as well. We know there's so much violence against women and girls in society. We know we live in a patriarchal rape culture where a lot of violence against women is dismissed, or it's neutralised, or people don't take it seriously. I don't want to say normalised, but I'm sure you would know what I mean. It's just, most of us have experienced it in some form. So my first findings chapter picked up on that, but it also picked up on something quite unique, that all of my participants had been the victims of violence, and my participants were mainly involved in street-based sex work. So that is, a very particular demographic. But all my participants had also been involved as being perpetrators of violence. And that was very interesting and quite unique finding. But that also speaks to the fact that people are caught, particularly for this demographic where I'm talking about, street-based sex workers who are in and out of prison, and who may be the consumers of, Class A drugs. They might have addiction problems, or a lot of feminisation of poverty can be seen here. Lots of complex problems that people are having to live with. So the idea that they'd all been victims of violence, and sometimes very serious forms of violence, it's like I described it in my PhD as like dog-eat-dog world. And I also coined the term almost violence, that even if you hadn't been, attacked, your friend had, or someone in your community had. So you're always on guard, and living constantly on edge like that is very difficult for people. So one of my participants came up with a brilliant quote that I actually wanted to call my PhD, but I wasn't allowed. That's another story. She said, it's all a big circle, isn't it? And what she meant by that was the route in and out of prison. Like, it's a revolving door. And she also meant in terms of violence, that she'd been the victim of violence multiple times. She'd also been the perpetrator of violence. And she just felt like it was just a big circle going round and round. And I just think that really summed, that chapter up really well. My second chapter actually looked at sex work as community, and actually spoke to, a lot of the reasons that sex workers don't want to leave sex work, even when we're talking about street-based sex work, is because they have a lot of friends. They have their community, they know they're marginalised, they know they're stigmatised, but when they're with their community, they're not. And therefore it makes sense to feel that identity and that belonging when you're with people that you feel are like you. And I can relate to that myself from, formerly being a lap dancer, and I write about that and I teach about that, but certainly it makes sense to be with people, to form a community of people who you feel are not going to judge you, are not going to stigmatise you. So that was my second chapter. And again, that was quite significant, because a lot of sex work charities and strategies, it's about pushing sex workers to exit. And Often people don't want to exit, or they certainly don't want to exit now. Exiting is normally a very long, non-linear process, and so it's really important. I used a bit of Bourdieu there. I didn't have like a grand theorist throughout my PhD. I used different theory, a lot of feminist standpoint theory, but I also used Bourdieu there to talk about habitus, to talk about, you know, how sex workers understand their realities and their communities, and that it's really important for policymakers, researchers, anybody, any stakeholder that's going to work with sex workers to recognise that. My third findings chapter was about how the bodies of women are used against them in the prison to punish them. And by that, I mean things like strip searching. So in the Corsten report, Baroness Corsten said that strip searching shouldn't be used unless absolutely necessary. But from my findings, and from the findings of many criminologists and sociologists, they found that strip searching is used when it doesn't have to be used. It's used against women who speak out. It's used against women who are deemed difficult. It's used as a way of punishing women. And again, that speaks to broader societal regulation and policing of women, particularly women who are seen to be, you know, problematic, transgressing gendered norms and roles and so on. And then my fourth findings chapter was the women's poetry. I wanted a chapter where the women's voices really spoke for themselves with quite minimal analysis, so that I wasn't, you know, speaking over their voices or for them, so their voices were really speaking for themselves.
Thank you for that, Gemma. Quite a lot to unpack there. I like those four different areas. If we can go back to the first point then, you said about sex workers as, did you say risky business, risky industry? How did you word it? Sorry.
Yeah, a risky business. So yeah, Professor Tila Sanders, who's one of the leading researchers in the sex work field, one of her first books related to that topic about sex work as a risky business. That kind of gave me the influence, the inspiration for giving my chapter that title, but very much that was one of the strongest themes that came out of my research.
Because what I was intrigued by that, I'm assuming that people understood that it was a risky business before they went into it. They were well aware of that, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I think because of the demographic that in that piece of research I was working with, so, you know, largely street-based sex workers, it is a very, like, some sex workers will work indoor and they'll work on the street, and they might work online as well. So I'm not saying they're completely separate facets of the industry. But generally speaking, outdoor sex work is very risky. It often, you know, I've got to be careful what I say, because, you know, a lot of people I'm friends with and followers are street-based sex workers, and I don't want to say anything that's stigmatising, but a lot of that demographic are using heroin and crack or have alcohol addiction, and they're doing it out of, you know, deprivation and need. So they are choosing to do it, and I think we have to be very careful there, that because otherwise it gets framed that, you know, sex workers have no autonomy and sex work is rape and it's buying consent and sex workers can't consent and so on. And people make decisions out of the range of options available to them, and some of us have more options available to us than others. So I want to make that very clear. But I think our current laws in this country often are why people do work on street, because in our country, it's a very grey area, sex work law. It's a system of partial or semi-criminalisation, where some acts are legal and some acts are illegal. And that means that for a sex worker to work indoors, for two or more workers working together from indoors, that constitutes a brothel, and that's illegal. One of that party could be charged with brothel keeping offences. So our current law, and the reason why so many of us advocate and campaign for decriminalisation, is so that sex workers can work together indoors if they wish, and that is obviously safer than working by themselves and working on street.
I wanted to pick up on something there. Sorry, I'm going slightly off topic where I wanted to, but I was really interested in what you just said there. What you just said about campaign and decriminalisation. I listened to an interview with the journalist Julie Bindel, and she was saying about the kind of factional division within the feminist world about what we should do with the sex work industry. Because on one side, you've got people saying we need to campaign, we need to decriminalise it. And Julie was saying, surely we should try and eradicate it altogether. And that's quite an interesting debate within the feminist world itself, isn't it, as to whether you are pro or anti-sex work as a whole?
Absolutely, and this is something we unpack in my third year module that I mentioned earlier. Something that I'd say is just because, what I say to my students, for example, is they might be, culturally or ideologically or, for religious reasons, they might be opposed to the sex industry. However, decriminalisation is, proven, and people like Amnesty International, World Health Organization, all the leading sex work researchers, decriminalisation is the safest option for sex workers. It doesn't mean it's risk-free. It also doesn't mean we're promoting prostitution, because many people who advocate or support decriminalisation would like a world without sex work. In fact, they'd like a world without, anyone being forced or to do any labour at all. I mean, exploitation exists in all industries. Something that I often speak about, and some people like it, some people don't, but tough, is that the industry I've been most exploited in is academia. Now I'm not being exploited. I've got a 3-year contract at a university, and that's great. But when I was a sessional lecturer, by the time I'd, turned up, travelled in and done my class and done my admin and marked, I was earning way less than minimum wage. I was earning I'd worked it out once, and it was less than £3 an hour when I was a sessional lecturer. So the industry I've been exploited in most is academia. And the industry I was exploited least in was the sex industry. And people don't like that, but we need to speak about labour frameworks and labour rights and exploitation more broadly, because people often, set aside the sex industry as being this unique site of exploitation, rather than thinking, what about all the other industries that are gendered? And what about all the other industries that exploit people or could potentially exploit people? So I think that decriminalisation, often people conflate legalisation and decriminalisation for a start, and they're different regulatory legal frameworks. But decriminalisation is just wanting harm reduction, and it's wanting people to have the most support, the least stigma. And that then means if people want to leave the industry, there's more support there to do so. But we know when things are criminalised, whether that's partially criminalised or whether that's, full crim, we know that makes it more dangerous and it drives sex workers underground. We can see that at the moment with the various campaigns to try and close down sexual entertainment venues, so lap dancing clubs. If those campaigns are successful, it won't stop lap dancing. It will just stop lap dancing in lap dancing clubs where there's security, where there's cameras, where they're licensed. There will be private parties, there will be hotel rooms, there will be back rooms in pubs or whatever, where the women have no protection and are a lot more vulnerable.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thinking specifically about prostitution then, do we have to, as a society, accept that it is there and it's never going to go away? I mean, is it a bit too naive to say it can be eradicated altogether? Do we just have to accept it as a part of life?
I think it is a very utopian position for people to talk about the eradication of prostitution, so full contact sex work. And I think that if people don't want it to be in society, then they really need to listen to current workers about what they want. And, that is the need for well-paid, flexible work, particularly for people with care responsibilities or who are studying or whatever. But I also think it speaks a lot more broadly to the regulation of women's bodies and women's sexuality, that a lot of people are so uncomfortable with it. But I also think it's fine if people are uncomfortable with it. As I say, everyone's view should be respected. And people coming from different cultural standpoints, religious standpoints, as I said, might have a different opinion. And that's fine. But it's about what is best for those working in the industry. And no matter what people say, the evidence is out there, and decriminalisation is the best system for that.
Because I also wondered as well, Gemma, was if there's a disconnect between what the media often present, particularly to do with prostitution, and the reality. And I was just considering, for example, we often see it from the outside as quite negative or suppressive, or females forced into it, or to aid a habit, for example. Are there people working in the industry that chose it, are happy with it, enjoy it, take a more positive stance?
Absolutely. And I also think it is really nuanced. So there are many people who've made that decision, are perfectly happy with it, are making good money, it fits in around their life. There are other people who have made that decision. They don't particularly like the job, but they like the money, they like the flexibility, and they still want the right to do it. So I think often things are positioned as really false binaries, the media in particular, this idea of, the belle de jour, the glamour of it, and then, in opposition to that, someone on the street who, has an addiction and has particular vulnerabilities, where there's a lot of space in the middle, particularly now. Now we know through the pandemic, a lot of sex workers have been displaced online, and a lot of people are on different platforms such as OnlyFans and its various counterparts. There are a lot of people who are dual working, so they might have a job doing whatever, a teacher, a lecturer, whatever they're doing, and they also sex work, and they might sex work sometimes. But I do think it's interesting that it's one of the last taboos. So I listened with great interest to your podcast you did with one of my former lecturers, Dr Jenny Van Hoof, and her research is amazing, and she was talking about, all the different forms of relationships and how people in our secular society, in our largely secular society, people have moved on often from marriage, but they're still seeking relationships, but there's many different forms of relationships, and why is one form the default position, and so on. And I think that people have to accept that people do different things than they do. So even if they're not comfortable with something, it really is just about the safety and the well-being of the people involved.
And that kind of brings you on to your second chapter as well, doesn't it? That kind of sense of community. I was really interested in that part of it then. So tell us more about that, because was that kind of a big factor in causing a lot of people to stay within the industry, that sense of community?
Absolutely, and a big part of that is the stigma attached to you when you've worked in the sex industry in any of its facets. So I know that myself. I've written a journal article about that came out in 2015 about being between the sex industry and academia, and how I am judged for that, particularly for speaking out openly about it. People don't like it. So in that chapter, my participants spoke very strongly about, liking the people that they work with and around, having lots of friends. A lot of my participants spoke about the fact that they've got other qualifications. One of my participants spoke about the fact, she left for a while. She's a hairdresser by trade. She could have done that, independently or working in a salon, but she didn't like it. She didn't like the 9-to-5 life. And in fact, she gave the quote, "Who's to say that working all year, 50 weeks of the year, 9-to-5, slaving away, and then having 2 weeks off for a holiday and then starting all over again. Who's to say that that's normal and acceptable or desirable?" And I really resonated with that, because as someone who's always had until academia, jobs on the margins or very flexible jobs. That's one of the things I like about academia. It is really, really flexible for me around my health, around my life, around my other commitments. I couldn't work a 9 to 5. I can't think of anything worse than working a 9 to 5. I just couldn't do it. I tried to do it once for like a week and it was just hell. So for a lot of people, you know, a lot of my participants spoke about working when they need to, working for a few weeks, saving up the money, getting what they need to pay their bills, have some extra, and then not working again for a few weeks. And I think we need to think about labour more broadly and why we think working a certain way or a certain pattern is desirable, because for many people it isn't.
And I also wonder as well, for many people, if they are in the sex industry work and they are making good money out of it, it's then very difficult to leave again.
Absolutely. It's hard. I make more money between the ages of 18 and 23 than I do now as an academic. That's hard. That's hard when you work really long hours and you work really hard. And it's not to say sex workers don't work hard, of course not, but it's the quick money. Yes. So as well, even if people aren't making loads of money, it's the fact it's quick and it's instant money. That is hard to get out of when you're then waiting for your monthly wages to hit your bank account and the budgeting of it, you know, and if your car needs a repair or your boiler breaks or your fridge or, you know, your kids need something or whatever. That is hard when you're used to having instant money. But yeah, you touched on the point there as well. Of course, if people are making good money in the sex industry, why would they want to leave to do something that society thinks is more respectable, that they're going to get paid perhaps minimum wage for?
Yeah, totally understandable. And Gemma, I'm really interested. I mentioned earlier about this kind of faction or division in the argument to do with sex work. What kind of opposition or criticisms have you faced after producing your own findings?
I have, not just after my findings, but, you know, on Twitter or when I speak out about various things, I've been called, well, we all get called kind of like a pimp, pro-pimp lobby, that I promote prostitution, that I promote rape, that I don't care about rape, that I don't care about victims of child sex abuse, just all that kind of really offensive attacks that don't account for my experiences, don't account for, you know, things I've been through in my life, and are just there to be very divisive and try and discredit and try and diminish. And I think that's a real shame, because I'm sure everybody, you know, no matter what their findings are or their ideological position, I'm quite sure that everybody does want the right outcome. I'm sure everyone's there for a good reason. I like to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. And I just think it's a shame that people can't work together more and that things have to be so polarised. I think that's a great shame. Twitter
can be quite a place at times, can't it? I mean,
definitely.
I've just had this today. I mean, I've been receiving messages, some nice, some not so nice, about a guest that I chose to have on. And, you know, I didn't necessarily agree with them. I just invited the person on to talk about their findings, and the abuse, the criticism, the messages that you can get. I mean, it's really quite scary sometimes. I'm sure you'll get it from your end as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just had a journal article out like 2 weeks ago in Methodological Innovations, and it's called Criminologist or Criminal, Liminal Spaces as the Site for Autobiography. And it's about my lived experiences with organised crime. And yeah, I say in that about we need to disrupt dominant ways of knowing, and we need to have transformative sites of messy meaning making. And I think we can only have those sites of really messy knowledge by conversing with people we might not agree with, we might not even like, but it's about bringing more people to the table and really hashing out ideas in a respectful way. And I think that's how the discipline grows and evolves, and that's how we can help more people.
I wholeheartedly agree, Gemma. I worry about this idea of an echo chamber where you only listen to people you agree with, and I think we need to challenge ourselves. You know, I've interviewed lots of people I don't necessarily agree with, but you can always learn from listening to people, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Gemma, I just wondered as well, have you seen in your time studying the sex industry, have you seen any shift in attitudes? You mentioned the word taboo. Has it become less taboo? Has it become more socially acceptable in the time that you've been researching?
I think what's interesting for me is there's definitely a gulf between how people might perceive it in the media or on Twitter, which can be an echo chamber and very divisive, whereas how my students relate to it. So certainly this year I launched my specialist third year module on the sex industry, and there were 103 third year students on it. And in the past, I've been lecturing for 8.5 years now, and in the past when I've lectured on other modules, but on the sex industry, there might be people who are really opposed and very vocal, great debates come from that. But this year, everybody, no matter what their personal opinion was like, what's the best way to support sex workers? What's the best way to challenge the stigma? What's the best way to promote harm reduction? So there's definitely been a shift in terms of learning about the sex industry from a student point of view, which I think is a great credit to students, to be honest, how switched on they are. I think elements of it have become less taboo in some ways, but then you only have to look at the current campaigns to close down lap dancing clubs to see that, it hasn't shifted that much. There are lots, there's an expression, isn't there, which sometimes I use to describe one of my poor dogs who's very noisy sometimes. Empty vessels make the loudest noise, or, like squeakiest wheels make the loudest noise. And sometimes it's the loudest voices, obviously, who we hear, who might, really speak out in opposition or whatnot. But there's a lot of people who are changing their perspective, and even though they might personally, I don't know, be offended by the sex industry or think it's whatever they think, they do want to help people within it. So they're listening a lot more. So I do think that shift has taken place. But I also think there still are a lot of people to whom the sex industry is just something they want to eradicate, no matter what the cost to people currently working in it.
Yeah. And I also wondered from the other point of view, I'm not sure what the right word is, clients, punters, customers, but the people who use sex industry, because is there still a taboo that it's seedy or perverted, anyone that uses something like prostitution?
I think often that is maybe the mainstream perspective. That's it, something that gets thrown around Twitter a lot, or you might see in the media. I think people who consume sex work are not, a homogenous group. People purchase sexual services for a variety of reasons. And I think people need to think about that as well, that all of this is so messy and nuanced and complex, and it doesn't really make sense to speak about it in binary and divisive ways because it's too complicated for that. It can't be contained within that framework.
Yeah, as to why someone is using the service could be for a multitude of reasons, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you could be someone who consumes some sort of sexual commerce and be very respectful, understand boundaries. You're using that service for whatever reason. You could be someone who, absolutely adamantly opposes the sex industry and you abuse women in other ways. You go around having unpaid sex, but you don't understand or respect boundaries and you don't care about women. So there's often, I always make the kind of maybe flippant comment to people that I had more respect from many of the clients that came in the clubs I worked in than I have from many men in left-wing circles who tell me sex work is disgusting, there must be something wrong with me, I'm not a proper academic, just utter disrespect that I never had in any club that I worked in. So I think, again, it's that messiness we need to think about, and why do we think, the bad men are over here doing this and those men over there are good, because it's just not like that.
Yeah. And one more question, if that's all right, Gemma?
Yeah.
I've used a lot of your time. I really, really appreciate it. I saw a tweet and I just really wondered what your thoughts were on it, because I saw a tweet that said, if you support the sex industry, you thus support patriarchy. And I thought, that is a bold claim. I just wondered what you thought about that, because it really caused a lot of debate. I'm not sure if you saw it yourself on Twitter, but where do you stand?
I didn't see that particular tweet, but I mean, I've seen many like that over the years, as you can imagine. I think supporting sex workers' rights is the best thing you can do against the patriarchy, because you're giving women the most options, the most support, against legal frameworks that often penalise sex workers. So sex workers are very uniquely positioned that in policy they are positioned as being inherently vulnerable. Yet when they enter the criminal justice system, that vulnerability is erased. And I use Dr Kate Brown from the University of York, her vulnerability framework there. But yeah, sex workers are positioned as being vulnerable, simultaneously having that vulnerability removed. So I think supporting sex workers and supporting all women and their autonomy, whether you agree with what they're doing or not, is the best way forward against the patriarchy. And that argument can be transferred to many, many different things in society. You know, you might not personally agree with abortion, but we must support women's rights to have bodily autonomy if they choose to have that. The same for, you know, we might be, I'm not, but some people might be quite secular, they might not be of faith, but they must support women to be able to wear as much or as little as they like, because patriarchy punishes women whatever we do. Whatever we do is seen to be the wrong thing. You know, we're sluts because we're in the sex industry and we're having too much sex, or we're, you know, frigid and we're not having enough. We're always the problem. We wear too little. We wear too much. We're too quiet, or we're too loud, or whatever it is. We're choosing to be mothers and prioritising that, and that is a bad thing. Or we're choosing to be child free and we must be punished for that. So I think that we need to stand with sex workers, and that is the best thing you can do against the patriarchy.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you. I'm gonna use that for a debate in the classroom. I think I'll be really interested to see what the students think about that.
Brilliant. You'll have to let me know how you get on. Feedback to me.
Yeah, I, you know, I'm not just saying it because I'm interviewing you, but I do think there'd be more support on your side of the argument. I just think there would.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Thank you, Gemma. Could I ask you, as I do with every guest, if you want to give out some details, if people want to learn more about your work or to follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, sure. So on Twitter, I am Princess Jack, and I've also got a popular criminology and sociology blog called www.plasticdollheads.wordpress.com, and I work at the University of Liverpool, so people can search for my staff profile and they can email me through that staff portal.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today, Gemma. Really, really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.